Hello and welcome to this week's edition of 50 Years Serving the Island, where each week we bring you highlights from Manx Radio's first 5 decades serving the public in the Isle of Man. In 1968, Manx Radio was transferred into public ownership to become the island's public service broadcaster. This week we revisit an edition of A Walk With, where Howard Caine took a walk around Old Peel with his uncle, the late Bernard Caine. Today we'll hear a section of the programme that was repeated in early 2016 and first broadcast in 2006.
A Walk With. This week we enjoy again a section of a walk around Old Peel with the late Bernard Caine, one of the island's great Manx scholars, raconteurs and true characters, who was a recent joint posthumous recipient of Ray Blaena Vananen, the Manx Cultural Award for 2016.
I suppose doing these sort of programmes, sooner or later it's bound to happen that you're going to have a walk with someone who was, well, relatively closely related. This gentleman this week we're having a little stroll with, we're related by marriage, it seems. That's mostly that of my parents. And it's a well-known resident in these parts, Mr. Bernard Caine, standing there resplendent on the corner of Albany Street. Who, well, I was going to say
Albany
you are...
Road.
Albany Road, I beg your pardon. And I was going to say you're a Peelie, but I suppose you're an incomer, really?
Oh yes, I didn't leave the world and come to Peel until 20-odd years ago, Howard. I was born in Douglas, down in Lee Terrace, which is... recently been widened. Anyway, that's by the by. We are in Peel here today. We just stood round the corner from where Joe, my wife, and I now live in Church Street at this rather unusual house called Sunnyside. And you can see why it's called Sunnyside.
Aptly named.
It's aptly named because the sun is coming down onto the front of it at the moment, where most of the other houses round about are in shade. Long years ago, this house was occupied by Mr. and Mrs. Boyd, Joe Boyd and Emily, and they were sort of vague relations of ours by marriage. I think I've got it right that Joe's father, when he was a widower, married a lady who was the sister of either your great-grandfather or possibly great-great-grandfather.
Oh, that's going back.
So my parents always considered Joe to be a cousin, and he also had a sister who lived just down the road a bit. And Joe had a shop in Peel where he sold shoes. It's now part of the Simpsons empire in Michael Street. But Joe lived here, and Dad used to quite often bring me out to visit Joe. We used to come by train. We'd get on Dad's bicycle. I say we. In those days, it was lawful, apparently, to carry a child on the crossbar of a bicycle. So Mum used to tie a cushion onto that, and I sat on this cushion, and we rode down to the railway station in Douglas, put the bicycle in the guard's van and came out here to Peel. And after Dad had done his business in the town, we usually came and had a cup of tea with Joe and Emily here. And we would have a pleasant chat, and often some rather interesting things came out after we left. Dad would tell me things about them, how, for example, one of the boys, I believe, had more or less eloped to the Channel Islands in order to marry his deceased wife's sister. And apparently this wasn't a lawful marriage in Britain as a whole in those days. Such a relationship came within the forbidden degrees of consanguinity and affinity, as the prayer book says. But it apparently was lawful to get married in the Channel Islands, so the story is that they went out there. There was also another member of the family who apparently went out to live initially I think in the Canary Islands and then in Spain, and got embroiled in some way or other in the Spanish Civil War.
Good Lord.
And one of his descendants, a young lad of about my own age, once came and stayed with Joe and Emily here, and I came over to visit them, and I learned my first few, and probably my only few words of Spanish, which was "Cuántos años tiene usted?" which apparently means "How old are you?" You know, it's a good start.
An excellent start in any language, I'd say.
You know, it gave rise to rather a short conversation. This house, too, incidentally, if you look at it, it's got all sorts of little sort of
ledgers
and such, and windows with fairly wide flat ledges on them. And there's this beading going around, if that's the correct word. And when my wife and I first came to Peel, we had 2 pussycats. And one day, we were at the front door, and we could hear the pussies calling. Meow, meow. So we're looking round in all directions, every direction, except straight up.
Not a place you normally... Well,
No.
perhaps you do with some cats.
And having failed to spot them on the ground level, I eventually looked up, and lo and behold, there they were on the roof. And we discovered later that what they'd done is they'd used these various ledges as a series of steps,
giant climbing frame,
to get up onto this roof, and then they'd gone round the corner and down along the roof ridge until they came to our house. So Joan was terrified that they would fall out. But they got up there, I feel fairly confident they'd get back down again. And so they did, but it was quite strange. I'm glad to say that the pussycats we had subsequently have never gone in for quite this sort of energetic degree of mountaineering.
Much to your relief, I dare say.
Much to our relief, yes. Just coming to the top of Mona Street here, and at this end, at the upper end, we've got the gate into the grounds of the cathedral, and we've got that signboard up saying Diocese of Soda and Man, St German's Cathedral, and the coat of arms there, which I'm quite convinced is wrong.
Thought you might be.
Well, if we just look at it.
Let's go and take a look. Yeah, just across the road here. A bit quieter down here, I'm glad to say.
You see, it consists of a shield, or the main part of it consists of a shield, and we have 2 pillars and of what here looks like a sort of tessellated or tiled floor.
Isn't it? Yes.
And we've got the arms of the island, the 3 legs of man.
It's the wrong way round, isn't it?
Well, that's debatable.
We're not going to split hairs.
And then we've got this figure of a lady. Now, some people say she's St Bridget, and some people say she's the Virgin Mary, but she does in her right hand have a sort of little model of a church, and this is sometimes said to be a symbol of somebody who founded or provided the funds for the founding of a church. But all the old descriptions of the coat of arms say that she should be standing on 3 ascents, that's to say 3 steps going upwards.
Yeah.
But as I say, in this illustration, she's standing on a sort of tiled floor.
Yeah.
So I've got my doubts as to whether that's a true and proper
Yeah.
representation
Base for her, really.
of the arms. But I suppose it's a debatable point. It's very, very difficult to get an authoritative account of such things.
View on these matters.
But,
Was it not originally St Germain's and not St German's?
well, again, there's arguments as to which German it is. I mean, the sort of generally accepted theory is that it's named after St Germanus, but there's other theories that it was probably some saint that came from Ireland.
It's one of these things, yes, lost in the mist of
It's one of these
time
things
somewhat.
lost in the mists of antiquity,
As
as
they
the
say.
saying is. If we just look across the road there, because we can see another building with a bell on it, which is quite
Oh yes, yes.
glowing in
scaffolding there.
the light at the moment. If we were to go down this street, let's go down this street
Okie doke.
for a moment.
We'll take a quick detour. Here we go, down a sneaky shortcut.
Coming down to what used to be Christian Street Chapel. Here on the corner, rather a handsome building, which has now been converted into apartments. And it's had quite since its interesting set of uses since it was closed as a chapel. For a while, quite a while, it was a sort of emporium for second-hand furniture. And
But before that was the original Murray Smoking
Motor
Museum was in
Museum,
here.
Was that right?
Yeah.
Yeah, the one that was up Snape.
That's up Snaefell. Started life in Peel.
Yeah. I remember being at some sort of exhibition that the government had put on for some purpose or other about proposed developments in Peel, and the map they had on display still had this marked as the Money's Motor Museum, which was stamping it being at least 30 years out of date at the time. But as you can see, it's rather a handsome building.
It's very handsome from this end.
After
yeah.
it ceased to be used as a chapel, a floor was put in between the balconies. It was sort of filled in, so you could go up onto that floor. And once or twice when our burgeoning film industry was doing things in Peel, it was used as a sort of headquarters, come changing room, come wardrobe department. That was it. So one time when they were desperate for extras, Joan and I volunteered, and it was quite handy because we were living as we are just round the corner, able to sit by the fire enjoying the telly and cups of coffee, and when they wanted us they would just nip round the corner, knock on the door and say, "Can you come down now please?"
Certainly.
It was very convenient. If you go back a long way, there were apparently 3 places or 3 bits of land where burials went on in Peel, and one of them was this chapel, and not many burials, but
One or two.
if we just go in through the gate here.
That's just opposite the Centenary Hall, which of course has all been renovated recently and now a splendid arts centre for the community.
And just go round here to the right. This gentleman.
We'll just go into the... there we go.
And here, what do we see?
Aha.
2 rather nice obelisks.
Indeed, very splendid.
Like
Just hiding behind the wall.
miniature,
One I was on about.
miniature versions of Cleopatra's Needle.
They are, aren't they? And here on the right, as you say, there's Reverend Lancelot Railton.
Now, rather sadly, his wife caught some sort of fever while she was visiting the sick, and her poor husband caught it from her.
Oh.
And they both died. And I believe that this monument, which is a bit worn and chipped
It's
now,
a little bit better, isn't it?
actually states that they were born, that they died on the same day, but other accounts I've seen say that there was a day between the
One and the other, as it were.
one death and the next, as it were.
Wouldn't be
Very
the time
sad.
of the cholera epidemic.
No. There was a lady who was connected with nobles. I can't bring in that main name to mind for the moment. I can see her in my mind's eye, but I can't just think of a name. She did some research into records connected with this, and I think she came to the conclusion that it was probably typhus that was raging here, prevalent at the time, rather than cholera. We had cholera here in the 1830s. This, as you can just see there, is dated 1864. They both, you see, there we are. See, he died on the 9th. And she died on the 10th.
They've got separate days.
So there was just one day between them.
That's it. The Reverend Lancelot Railton at Reeds, born at Barnard Castle, 23rd of June, that is, 1811, died at Peel. And as Bernard says, on the 9th of November 1864, and right underneath, Margaret Railton, born at Edinburgh, a bit missing there, but it's October of 1814, and then, as we say, the next day, died at Peel on the 10th of November 1864. Very sad.
But she apparently took ill first, and it said that he contracted the infection, whatever it was,
From her.
You're listening to 50 Years Serving the Island, a series of programmes featuring highlights from Manx Radio's archives during the station's first 5 decades serving the public in the Isle of Man. Today we bring you an edition of A Walk With, presented by Howard Caine, where he and his uncle, the late Bernard Caine, took a walk around Peel in 2006.
A little bit further up, outside the gates to the rear entrance to the cathedral. Let's just cross away there.
Well, here we are, we're coming through these rather nice cast iron gates. We're lucky that a fair amount of gates and railings survived in the Isle of Man in so many places across the water, because they were taken away during the wartime and melted down for scrap for use in munitions. But we still got these gates here at the lower end, the Athol Street end of the cathedral's grounds. If we look up the slope from here, we see the west end of the cathedral. If we'd been here many, many years ago, we might well have seen a very high spire on top of the cathedral, rising from the second, or probably is it the third stage of the tower.
Mm-hmm.
But this was taken down because there was a degree of subsidence. The story goes that whoever built the tower used mortar, which wasn't very stable. I've heard it said that the mortar was made with lime that hadn't much life in it. You know,
Nice way of putting it.
Well, they refer to quick lime, quick in the sense of quick in the dead, the living and the dead. And that this especially where it was underground, never really set, I should say. Anyway, there was a degree of subsidence, and for safety's sake, they had to take the tower down. There was also a sort of hurricane, I think, if I'm right in saying it was about 1903, during which there was considerable amount of damage done to the roof and also to the west window, as we're seeing it now straight in front of us. That's the window, incidentally.
Quick departure.
Yeah, that's the window whose designs are used in the Christmas stamps this year.
Oh, of course, yes.
Yeah,
That looked vaguely familiar.
Very, very, very nice.
Yeah. So
In front of the west end there, we can see the War Memorial, which, like many of the memorials on the island, is in the form of a Celtic cross. We do at this time of day get rather a splendid view with the sunlight on the church.
It does. It's lovely, isn't it? Yeah.
This
the sun
was
setting
known
on
for
a
a long
fine day.
time as the new church. Apparently, when it was built, it was for a long time it had no other name but that. It was to replace St. Peter's Church, which had fallen into disrepute. And
Oh, whereabouts was St. Peter's? That was
down on the marketplace.
down the marketplace.
Yeah.
There.
That was a very old church. Its origins go back hundreds and hundreds of years, and served as a parish church both for Patrick and for the parish of German at one time. It was a sort of replacement in a way, or a chapel of ease for the churches in the cathedral on the old cathedral, that is, on St. Patrick's Isle. It's got into a state which I think could be referred to now as a controlled ruin. It, like a lot of other Manx churches, it had a very hard time apparently in the 18th century, but it was done up quite a bit. And after it ceased to be used as a parish church, it was used as a sort of mission church, apparently.
Just opposite the White House, if you can think where we are, which is used by building trucks now and DOT lorries, but it looks at
Well, just
a
on
boat
the
yard.
other side of the road here,
There it is.
We've
Here,
got-
Popworks Cottage.
we've got a sign that says Popworks Cottage number 1. The building here had belonged, that was here before this, had belonged to I think the father of the late Mr. Irving, Jack Irving. And it was actually a little works manufacturing mineral waters, or pop. And eventually the building fell into disrepair and was taken down. So you had then this site here, which was very narrow, but just big enough to build this rather splendid bijou residence. It's a very cosy little place inside.
It is. It's
for one or two people, and appropriately was given the title Potworks Cottage. That reminds me actually about the time when I was a youngster living in Brighton Terrace, because just down the road from us, down towards the Rosemount Hotel, there was a little area on the right-hand side of the road, and bounded by a row of about 3 houses, the name of which eludes me for a moment. But there were sort of ramshackle sort of garages there, and there were 2 gentlemen who sort of hung about in there, one of whom had a bit of a limp. And there was a story that these gents had at one time had a mineral water works as well. And they'd had some sort of an industrial accident. I don't know whether it was a fire or an explosion or something in the place. And the story was that the place had not been insured and they'd virtually lost everything, you know. And as kids, if we wanted to get up to Divilment, we used to go down towards this place and shout or chant, "Let's blow up the pop works, let's blow up." And they would chase after us, you know. And there was one occasion where one of them had a big spanner in his hand and chased us for miles, you know. I don't know quite what you would have done if he'd caught up.
actually got you. Yes. Probably just as well you were a fast runner in those days.
The imagination boggles. But I just remember what that little row of houses was. It was called Edgerton Terrace. And alongside, as you're going down towards Edgerton Terrace, there's a railing that I've mentioned how most of our railings survived, but this railing had uprights, and then at the top it had a flat bar, and above that there were sort of spikes, you see, and on the top of the vertical bars, and most of these spikes at some stage or other had been broken off, and as kids we used to walk along the top of that. And I was passing it recently, and I looked at this, and I thought it's only about 1.5 inches wide, you know. And yet we quite gaily used to walk along the top of this.
We'll just cross the road to take a look at the back of St. Peter's here.
When this building was first built, allegedly, it was back in about 1550, so they say. Some people believe it might even have been earlier than that. And it was what they called a chapel of ease, which is a sort of adjunct to a parish church. And it eventually became the parish church for both Patrica and German. And apparently it was quite a small, sort of rectangular building originally, like a lot of Manx churches would have been. And gradually it got built onto, and it apparently grew into a sort of cross-shaped building with a gallery inside it. But for some reason, I've never really fully understood this, but in the middle of the 18th century, it was one of a number of churches on the island that fell into very severe disrepair. One of the problems was, and this happened in a lot of churches, was that people who were landowners in the area, particularly people who owned quarterland farms, had allocated to them what was called a seat in the church. Now, this didn't necessarily imply just a wooden pew, but an actual little bit of the space within the church. And traditionally, they claimed a right to bury their dead actually in those seats. So, using the word in that sense. And because this caused great disturbance, digging up the floor of the church so that there was never an intact proper floor in the place. The building walls, or the building's walls, tended to be undermined by all this digging going on, and it was a cause of great and constant damage to the buildings. And I think it was either Bishop Wilson or Bishop Hildesley eventually made an order preventing this. It was proscribed, and you weren't allowed then to bury the dead within so many feet of the walls of the building, either inside or out. But apparently it was a great cause of problem here in Peel, and it said sometimes that when they dug a grave for one body, they sort of disinterred 2 or 3 other ones. So there was a sort of an outcry about this, and there was actually a sort of island-wide commission into burying places. I think it was in about 1870 or thereabouts that they held this, and they said at the time that there wasn't really, well, there was a demand from the public for a proper burial place for Peel, and it would say, well, there are 3 places already. Well, we've already visited 2 of them, the one at the Methodist Church, this one, and the third one, of course, was in the old cathedral on St Patrick's Isle, which I think, as I mentioned before, was described as being for the use or for the purpose of burying the Roman Catholic people and shipwrecked deceased people who'd been shipwrecked. But they were hardly adequate to cover the requirements of the parish.
Yeah.
So they eventually got the new burial ground out past the school there.
A walk around parts of Old Peel with Bernard Caine, which we've been listening to again today to mark Bernard's recent posthumous joint award of Ray Blainer Vinanen for 2016.
You've been listening to this week's edition of 50 Years Serving the Island, where we heard a section of an edition of A Walk With, presented by Howard Caine and featuring the late Bernard Caine. The original programme was first broadcast in 2006. And you'll shortly be able to hear this programme again, along with lots more exclusive content from Manx Radio's archives by going to manxradio.com/portal.